my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and I am back with the very last chapter of Beverly Cleary's Henry and the Clubhouse. We are on chapter 7, Henry's Little Shadow. Afterwards, Henry realized that he should have known something would go wrong with his plan to keep Ramona from pestering him. Now, because he was a friend of Sheriff Bud, Henry had become such a hero to Ramona that she wanted to follow him wherever he went. Next, Mrs. Quimby said that she was disgusted with the Sheriff Bud program and Ramona was not to watch it anymore. Not ever. This left Ramona plenty of time for tagging after Henry. The worst part of it was there was nothing Henry could do about Ramona tagging along because she behaved herself. She stood quietly on Mr. Caper's driveway while Henry folded his papers. Henry began to wish she would pester him so that he could yell at her to go away. Fortunately, none of the other paper carriers thought much about her because many small children in the neighborhood admired the big boys who delivered the papers. Henry was always glad to spring on his bicycle and ride away from her. If he had delivered his papers on foot, she would have tagged after him. Then one day at school, Beezus said, "Henry, I don't think you are going to like what Ramona is going to get for Christmas." "What is she getting?" asked Henry. Beezus looked worried. "I'm not supposed to tell. I just thought I had better warn you is all." Henry did not know what to make of this message. He did not see how a doll or whatever it was that a girl in kindergarten was going to get for Christmas could bother him. As for himself, he hoped he would get a sleeping bag because he had not saved his paper out money as fast as he had expected. He had spent quite a lot on nails and a padlock for the clubhouse. And when he counted the money he had collected for his paper route, he found he was short a couple of dollars and realized he must have made some mistakes in giving change. This cut into his profits, and after he had done his Christmas shopping, he was still several dollars short for a sleeping bag. Henry was not disappointed on Christmas morning when he opened a big package and found not a sleeping bag, but a microscope. He could have a lot of fun with the microscope. It was so cold that his mother would not let him sleep outdoors anyway, and next month he would have enough money to buy that sleeping bag. It was not until Christmas afternoon, when Henry was folding his papers, that Henry found out what Beezus meant. He looked up and saw Ramona standing there on the driveway in her snowsuit. Henry dropped the paper he was folding when he saw that over her shoulders she was carrying a cloth bag, a small copy of the one journal carriers wore. It even had "Read the Journal" embroidered on it in red yarn. Embroidered! It was terrible! In each half of her bag, Ramona carried some old rolled-up newspapers. She also carried a battered teddy bear in the front half. She was smiling proudly. Naturally, the other carriers practically laughed themselves sick at the sight of Henry's admirer. Red with embarrassment, Henry tried to pretend he did not see Ramona. He bent over and folded his papers as fast as he could so he could get out of there. "Henry, see what Santa Claus brought me?" said Ramona, ignoring the laughter. "Now I can be a paper boy like you." The other boys whooped. "Why don't you go home?" Henry asked crossly. "I want to watch," said Ramona politely. Henry could see that in spite of the boys' laughter, Ramona was proud of her very own journal bag, and there was nothing he could do about it because she had kept her promise to Sheriff Bud and was being good. Henry could see that another of his good ideas had turned out wrong. Even Ramona was good. She was a problem. Then Beezus, wearing a brand new Christmas car coat with a hood, came hurrying up the driveway. "Come on home, Ramona," she said, then turned to Henry. "I tried to warn you. A journal bag was the only thing she wanted for Christmas, and so Mother had to make her one. She had a terrible time. She couldn't find a pattern." Henry slung his bag of journals over his shoulder. "Thanks anyway," he said ruefully, as he threw his leg over his bicycle and rode away from Ramona and the laughter of the other boys. The next morning, when Henry woke up, he discovered that snow was beginning to fall. A few light flakes at first, and then more and larger flakes. What luck! Snow during Christmas vacation. He looked out of his bedroom window and saw that there was already an inch of snow on the roof of the clubhouse. After breakfast, Henry dragged his flexible flyer out of the basement to have it ready in case there was enough snow for coasting. All morning, snow fell. By noon, it was easy to roll up a snowman. The police blocked off a hill not far from Henry's house, and all the boys and the girls went coasting. Henry slid so much and got into so many snow fights, he had to go home and put his clothes through his mother's clothes dryer before he could go out again. Cars that did not have snow tires slipped on the icy pavement and skidded into curbs. Some people who were fortunate enough to have their chains with them thumped down the street as the snow packed down the ice into ice. By 3 o'clock, Mr. Huggins came driving slowly up the street and skidded gently into a drift at the foot of the driveway. He said the stores downtown were closed and many people could not get across the bridges because the streets were blocked by skidding cars. Mrs. Huggins looked into the refrigerator and the cupboards to see how much food she had on hand because she could not go to the market and there was no telling when the milkman could get through. The whole city was in a wonderful state of confusion, and Henry enjoyed every minute of it. He hoped it would be days, even weeks, before the snow thawed. Then the mailman, a muffler tied over his ears and his hat on top of that, came puffing up the steps hours late. The sight of him reminded Henry that he too had work to do, and it was not going to be easy in this weather. Snow or no snow, the journal had to be delivered. Henry dried his woolen gloves in the dryer for the 3rd time that day before he started out, this time on foot. At Mr. Caper's garage, he had a long, cold wait before the truck that brought the papers was able to get through. "Foot of Snow, Blanket City" was the headline that day. In spite of the cold, Ramona also waited in her snowsuit with her little journal bag over her shoulders. She kept busy by making a snowman on the driveway. "Fadada, fadada, fadada," she said to herself as she worked. When the snowman was finished, she tried her journal bag on it. Henry hoped she would leave it there, but she did not. She put it over her own shoulders again. When Henry had managed to fold his papers with fingers numbed by cold, he discovered that this time Ramona could tag after him because he had to cover his route on foot. And follow him through the snow she did, about 10 feet behind him, even though walking was not easy. In some places, the snow had drifted. In others, it was packed down into ice. Henry walked as fast as he could, but Ramona struggled along after him. A man who was trying to shovel snow in front of his house grinned at Henry and said, "I see you have a little shadow." Henry was mighty glad to see Beezus clumping through the snow in her boots. "Come on home, Ramona," she coaxed. "It's getting colder." "No," said Ramona, "I want to go with Henry." She trudged along in her boots, and there was nothing for Beezus to do but follow along and keep an eye on her. Henry threw the first paper, which landed with a plop in the snow that had drifted on his customer's front steps. Softly, a few flakes of snow fell on the paper. "This isn't going to work," thought Henry. "The papers would be buried in this side of the street where the snow was drifting. Nobody would be able to find them." He struggled up the front walk, his heavy journal bag banging against his legs, and picked the paper out of the drift. Then he rang the doorbell and handed the paper to his customer, who thanked him and said with a smile, "I see you have a little shadow." "Yeah," said Henry, without enthusiasm. Henry soon saw that it was too much work to wade through drifts with his journal bag bumping against his legs. "Beezus, do me a favor, will you?" he asked. "Go get my sled for me." It will take quite a while if I have to take Ramona with me," said Beezus. "I could go faster without her." Henry realized this was true. Ramona's legs were too short, and the snow was almost to the top of her boots. He did need that sled, though. "Okay, she can tag along with me," he said, knowing she would, whether he wanted her to or not. Silently, Ramona floundered along after him, and Henry grudgingly admitted to himself that she was not pestering him. She had a perfect right to be on the sidewalk, didn't she? If only she were not wearing that ridiculous journal bag. And if only everyone he met would not say, "I see you have a little shadow." Once Ramona had said companionably, "There is an easy house number, 1001. She was proud of her new ability to read numbers. Henry did not answer her. It was not long until Beezus came, dragging Henry's sled behind her. He was mighty glad to lift the papers from his shoulders and set them on the sled. "Come on, Ramona," coaxed Beezus. "You can be a paper boy some other day." "No, I can't," said Ramona in a small voice. "Henry always rides his bicycle, and I can't keep up with him." So on they trudged. The next house on the snowdrift side of the street was the house of Mrs. Peabody. Henry took a paper from his sled, waded up to the front door, and rang the doorbell. "Why, it's Henry Huggins!" exclaimed Mrs. Peabody, opening the door just a crack so the cold would not come in. "My, but you are a thoughtful boy to bring the paper right to the front door." "His name isn't Henry Higgins," Ramona shouted. "His name is Henry Huggins." Mrs. Peabody looked startled and opened the door a bit wider. "Is it really?" she asked Henry. "Well, yes," admitted Henry, "but that's all right." Just the same, he was grateful to Ramona for straightening Mrs. Peabody out. He felt almost kindly toward the little girl in spite of that terrible journal bag. "My, I am so sorry," said Mrs. Peabody. "To think that I've been calling you Harry Higgins all this time when your name is really Henry Huggins. I didn't see how I could make such a mistake." I knew who you meant." Henry was embarrassed. Ramona began to cry. "Come on, let's go home," said Beezus impatiently. Ramona cried harder. "I'm too tired," she sobbed. "Why, the poor little thing," said Mrs. Peabody. "She's all worn out. If I could get my car out of the garage, I would drive her home myself." Henry looked at Ramona, standing there sobbing in the snow. Her face was red with cold and blotched with tears. With her boots buried in snow, she looked even smaller than she really was. She rubbed her eyes with her cold, soggy mitten and sniffed pitifully. Henry's feelings were all mixed up. He remembered how she had locked him in the clubhouse, and what a pest she had been. At the same time, he was grateful to her, because she had told Mrs. Peabody his real name. "Doggone it," thought Henry. "Doggone it all anyway. Why did this have to go and happen?" He felt sorry for Ramona, actually felt sorry for her. This was really the last straw. He did not want to feel sorry for Ramona in that stupid old journal bag of hers. He tried hard not to feel sorry for her, but he could not help himself. "Come on, Ramona," he said, even though he didn't want to. "Get on the sled, and I'll pull you home." "I'll help," said Beezus gratefully. She lifted her little sister onto the sled in front of Henry's papers. "Now hang on." Henry and Beezus took the rope and began to pull the sled. By this time, the streets were almost empty of cars, and they could run, slipping and sliding on the snow that had been packed into ice. Ramona stopped crying. "Mush," she yelled between sniffs. "Mush." "Ah, keep quiet," said Henry rudely. He was in no mood to play sled dog for Ramona. He did not feel that sorry for her. "Oh, thank you, Henry," said Beezus when they had deposited Ramona on her front steps. "I don't know how I would have ever gotten her home without your help." "That's okay," said Henry gruffly, and retraced his steps to start his route once more. And all because of Ramona. It seemed to Henry that he had never had a worse time delivering papers, not even when there was an extra thick Sunday edition. Half his papers had to be delivered to the door and at least stuffed into the mailbox. He was too warm inside his car coat, but an icy wind began to blow through his trousers, chilling his legs. His boots were heavy and his gloves were wet again. He was tired, cross, and hungry. By the time Henry had delivered his last paper and dragged his sled home again, it was dark and snow was falling through patches of light cast by the street lamps. "Henry, I was beginning to worry about you," said Mrs. Huggins when he had stamped the snow off his boots and entered the kitchen. "It takes longer to deliver papers in the snow," Mrs. Huggins pointed out. "It sure does," Mr. Huggins pointed out. "It sure does, Dad," agreed Henry. It sure does. And he thought, especially when someone like Ramona lives on the route. The next day, the snow had stopped and the sun shone on the sparkling world. The city began to recover. Snow plows cleared the main streets, and by late afternoon, most of Henry's neighbors had shoveled their walks. Henry was rested, but so was Ramona. As soon as he started his paper route, there she was again, wearing her little journal bag. Henry wished all the snow was cleared away so he could ride his bicycle again. Ramona, still very good, tagged along, and all the people who were now shoveling their driveways stopped working and smiled and said, "I see you have a little shadow." There was nothing Henry could do about it. A line of the poem he had once had to speak in school kept running through his mind. "I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see." Boy, whoever wrote that poem knew what he was talking about. The third day, just enough snow had fallen to freeze on the cleared sidewalks and make them too slippery for Henry to ride his bicycle. Because delivering papers was still difficult, Henry and the other boys gathered early to fold and count the papers. Henry was almost ready to start his route when Mr. Caper came around to check on the boys. He grinned at Henry. "Well, Henry," he said, "I see you got your name in the paper." "Who, me?" asked Henry in surprise. "Yes, Henry Huggins," said Mr. Caper, opening a paper right here on the editorial page. Henry could not understand what Mr. Caper was talking about. What would his name be doing on the editorial page or any place else in the newspaper? It must be some other Henry Huggins. Mr. Caper began to read, "Dear Editor." Henry understood that much. Someone had written a letter to the newspaper. "Dear Editor," Mr. Caper read, "I wish to call attention to the fine work a boy named Henry Huggins is doing delivering the journal in our neighborhood." "Hey, that's me!" exclaimed Henry. "I told you," said Mr. Caper, and continued reading for all the boys to hear. Henry is always prompt and courteous, but it was yesterday during the heavy snowstorm that I was particularly impressed with his work. Delivering papers that day was not easy, but Henry went out of his way to ring my doorbell and hand me my paper so that it would not be buried in the snowdrift. Not only that, he took time out from his route to give a little girl who was cold and tired a ride home in his sled. The Journal should be proud of this fine young citizen. Sincerely yours, Bessie Peabody. At first, Henry was speechless, and then he felt as if he was suddenly growing about 4 inches taller. All the other carriers looked at Henry with respect. "Boy, I wish somebody would write a letter like that about me," said Scooter. "I've been delivering papers 3 years and nobody ever wrote a letter about me," said Joe. "Me neither," said all the other boys. "And Henry is our youngest carrier," Mr. Caper reminded them. He gave Henry a friendly slap on the shoulder. "Keep up the good work, Henry. I am proud of you." Henry felt himself grow another inch. Mr. Caper was proud of him. He had said so in front of all of the other boys. On his way down the driveway, Henry passed Ramona with her little journal bag over her shoulder. She slipped on an icy spot and sat down hard. Before she could start to howl, Henry boosted her to her feet because he suddenly realized that if it weren't for Ramona, Mrs. Peabody would have written a letter to the Journal praising Harry Higgins, and Mr. Caper would have thought it was about a carrier in some other neighborhood. Henry knew he had had a very close call. "Be careful and don't fall again," he cautioned Ramona. "You might get hurt." Then he started delivering papers with Ramona following 10 feet behind him. Today, this did not bother him. Mr. Caper was proud of him, so he did not care who tagged after him. Besides, he was too busy thinking what his father would say when he read Mrs. Peabody's letter in his evening paper. Henry decided not to say anything to his father. He would let him discover the letter for himself. His father would be reading along, and all of a sudden he would see Henry's name in the paper. He would probably be so surprised that he would jump out of his chair. That evening, it seemed to Henry that his father never would get around to reading the paper. First, he dawdled over his dessert and asked for a second cup of coffee. "Why are you so restless tonight?" Mr. Huggins asked Henry. Me? I'm not restless, said Henry, wishing his father would hurry up and drink that coffee. I'll carry your dishes into the kitchen, Dad, Henry offered. Mr. Huggins looked surprised. He got up from the table and remarked, Maybe I'll build a fire in the fireplace. It's such a cold night. That's funny, Dad, said Henry. I was just thinking it was awfully warm in here. Mr. Huggins turned on the television set. That was too much for Henry. He could not wait any longer. Say, Dad, did you read tonight's paper? He asked. I glanced at the headlines. Why? Well, I just wondered if you happened to read the editorial page, said Henry. Not yet. Mr. Huggins looked curiously at his son. Why are you so interested? I got my name in the paper. Henry could not keep the pride out of his voice. On the editorial page? Mr. Huggins sounded disbelieving as he reached for the evening paper. He folded it back to the editorial page. There! Henry pointed at the letter. What is it? Asked Mrs. Huggins, coming in from the kitchen. She leaned over her husband's shoulder to read. Why, Henry, she exclaimed, wasn't that a nice thing for Mrs. Peabody to do for you? Henry, I am proud of you, said Mr. Huggins. I don't care how much snow there is. I'm going right out and buy 6 papers so we can send copies of this to your relatives. Gee, thanks, Dad, said Henry modestly. He had waited a long time to hear his father say that he was proud of him. I'll admit that when you took on the route and then got mixed up in building that clubhouse, I didn't think you could handle it, but you've done a good job, said Mr. Huggins. Henry was pleased and at the same time a little embarrassed by this praise from his father. Mr. Huggins went to the hall closet and put on his overcoat and hat. By the way, he remarked, how much more money do you need for that sleeping bag? About $5, Henry admitted. Mr. Huggins took out his wallet, opened it, and handed Henry a $5 bill. There you are. Tomorrow you go to the sporting goods store and you buy that sleeping bag. Thanks, Dad. Henry accepted the bill. You mean I can sleep out in the clubhouse when there's snow? Mrs. Huggins spoke up. You may not. Do you think I want you catching your death of cold? But the sleeping bag is filled with down, Henry pointed out. It's nice and warm. I don't care, said Mrs. Huggins. You can't sleep out until you have some warm, dry weather. Okay, Mom. Henry was agreeable because he had not really expected his mother to let him sleep outdoors in the snow. He would have the sleeping bag, and that was all that counted. That, and knowing his father and Mr. Caper were proud of him and realized that he could handle a paper route. Coming with me, Henry, said Mr. Huggins. Sure, Dad. Henry pulled his coat out of the closet. Good old Mrs. Peabody, he thought to himself as he put on his cap and pulled the ear flaps down over his ears. He knew she would be the best customer on my route. He picked up his paper to admire his name in the print once more, and as he looked at it, he could not help thinking, good old Ramona. That is the end of the last chapter, so let's look at the pictures. I thought the beginning picture was pretty nice. So see, you've got a little shadow dash there at the top of the chapter. And then here is the picture of Ramona showing up the day after Christmas with her bag, or Christmas afternoon. There's Henry folding his papers, and he sees Ramona with her new journal bag. And he is mortified. That means embarrassed, right? Here is poor Ramona. And she finally got so tired of dragging around after Henry that she began to cry. She was cold and she was tired. And here is Henry being congratulated by Mr. Caper, and all the other boys are looking at him with respect because he got his name in the paper. And the last little picture is Henry taking one more look at the newspaper because he likes to see his name in print. And he appreciates little Ramona a little bit more than he did at the beginning of the story, didn't he? And that was Henry in the Clubhouse by Beverly Cleary. I hope you have enjoyed this book as much as I have. Stay tuned for another one soon. This is Grandma Carla, and I love you.